2, 3. Testing, testing. All right, boys and girls, let's kick this thing off. Move on inside, please. Usual herding cats. You got something there. He's moving.
I can't whistle.
Do you want me to whistle?
Sure, why not?
Oh, broken.
Epic fail. Epic fail.
Very good. Neil,
Hello.
here's two of your speakers today. So from Qual IT,
Yes.
Shane and Bruce. Shane and Bruce. So,
Hello.
so they'll be up
Bruce.
front loitering around.
Good to meet you. Let's move on inside, please. Thank you. You guys going to sit up front somewhere? Is the cooling on? Best we can do anyway. Come on, fill up from the front. As ever, there's some seats up the front. There's a surprise. All right, time to simmer down. Bit of shush. Thank you. There's some seats up the front. You can ask questions if you sit at the front.
It's better.
Silence descends. Oh, it worked. I'm always impressed. Surprised. Surprised and impressed. Hi. Welcome, everyone. Welcome our online audience. You're not forgotten. Hello. Welcome to Canterbury Tech for May. For those I don't know, I'm Neil Hamilton, General Manager of Canterbury Tech. Thanks for coming. It's warm, isn't it? Sorry about that. I think we've got the cooler going, but it's working overtime. So if you see those beads of sweat running down my forehead, apologies. So here's what we're going to do. I get to do a welcome and health and safety, which I've forgotten from last time, but all those that know this building know there's 4 exits. I'll do the flight crew thing. Down there and at either end of the building. It's a pretty safe building. There's a lot of timber in this place, so if there's an earthquake, I wouldn't bother going anywhere. You're probably safer inside than out. What else do I have to say on the health and safety? I should have read this beforehand. Better check I'm not missing anything. Yeah, the bathrooms, good idea, yeah. There's some out that way, some down that way. And we do have first aiders on site if we have any issues on that front. Okay, hopefully that does the job. We've got one quick pitch this evening. Stephen, where's Stephen? I met him earlier. No, not yet, wait for it. Man, he's keen. But you better, if it's that hard to get up here, you better come up here. Stephen Judd from Catalyst. And then we got presentations from Josh from Lateral. That's terrible, isn't it? Lateral. I haven't had that much beer, honest. Josh Brody from Lateral and Bruce Melrose and Shane Cossar from Qual IT. bit more networking at the end, and then we can all go home and have dinner at 7 o'clock or thereabouts. Thanks to our venue host this evening. You're in the building. Epic. Thanks again. We were here last month. It's been a while, and I think all of our events for the latter part of this year are going to be at other events around town. As always, a warm welcome to our newest members. I saw Sean somewhere. Where's Sean? There he is. Sean from 2040 and a couple of students. Are you in the room, student? These students? Oh, hello, welcome. There he is up the back there. Everybody stare at this man at the back. and go and say hello. Make them feel welcome, first and foremost. So a bit of Canterbury Tech news. We had the meet and greet for our first mentoring program for the year last night. 20 mentor-mentee pairs at Tauranga. Career start, so that's underway. It was fun. I got roped in at the last minute as a spare mentor. Looking forward to it. It's always fun to work with people. It's over a short period of time, 12 weeks. We're expected to meet 6 times over that period. So applications open for this program, which is sort of a mid-career thing. It's 2 general types of people. Mentees apply for this. One is technical people who want some technical mentoring to become a better technologist. And the second broad group is people who want to develop into some sort of leadership role. So I think we're a little bit short of mentors for this at the moment. I think we're looking reasonably good on both sides, but if you're a prospective mentor, have a look, give it a go. I always get something out of this. It's not just the mentee that gets something out of it. So take a look. And then the late career option, which is opening soon. And this is meant to be people who are, unsurprisingly, later in their career. Some people who are looking to retire or have recently retired and want to give back to our technology community, sort of giving some hints and tips as to how they might go about that. So that's the third program. I would think we'll have probably 50 to 60 mentor-mentee pairs this year, so that's pretty good going. It's one of those sort of grassroots things. It's not too difficult for us to run these things, but it does require, we've got 4 active volunteers who make this happen, so thanks to all of them, and I'll call them out by name maybe next month. Other things going on, this is a joint event with IT professionals on next week at Loft, the Privacy Commission. Not our slide. Privacy Commissioner John Edwards is in town, so that's on at Loft. Take a look. And Tech Week is rapidly approaching the end of this month. There are a reasonable range of events on in Christchurch and a whole lot of stuff on nationally, a good chunk of which is available online. Locally, there's a couple of things. Women in Tech, Heidi, I see you. Go talk to Heidi if you want to know more about that. Really active group locally. And the event that we, Canterbury Tech, have chosen to run during Tech Week is building on a theme from last year's Tech Week, Pathways into Tech. We know not enough youngsters are choosing to pursue a career in technology. So this year we've got this event going, which is a few young entrepreneurs who run technology startups, talking about their experience and some of the support that's available to youngsters who might choose to pursue this as a career path on at ARA, Tuesday the 25th, early evening. And Tech Summit, mentioned it last month. I'll keep banging on about it every month until September, but put the date in your diary. Thursday, the 2nd of September, I want and expect to get 500 people coming along this year. Last year we held Tech Summit, but it was a fairly modest affair. So this is I see it as a stepping stone back to a significant event, possibly at Tapai, the convention centre in 2022. But let's not skip over this year. It'll be, this is a good venue. The UC Student Association, relatively new building, really good for networking. There will be good beer and nibbles and all the other things that people come to expect from a Canterbury Tech event. Do put it in your diary. A couple of speakers there. There's some other really interesting speakers bubbling. Pressure's on me to get that program sorted, but I will. And those of you in the room who want to stump up some sponsorship dollars, get your checkbook out. Not sure if we can take credit card, but anyway, a lot of you we've communicated with about, we can take credit card. Excellent, I didn't know we could do that. So we'll take your money. Various sponsorship packages available, standard conference thing. It will be worthwhile. We're going to have 2 main streams, and in the afternoon, it's a full day event. In the afternoon of Tech Summit, we're going to have a mini stream around applied game development as well, with people from HitLab and other local AR, VR applied game companies, basically. So I'm actually looking for expressions of interest from other groups who might want to run a similar mini stream in the morning of Tech Summit. The room's there, we'll take care of the logistics, you have to take care of the program. So if you're interested, get in touch. I'll be reaching out to a couple of groups locally to see what we can jack up on that front. Some other things going on, the BOMA Agritech Summit, the Food Fibre Agritech Supernode, one of my other hats has been facilitating the accelerator for this. Just announced the 10 finalists who'll be pitching their food, fibre and agritech ventures to an audience. I think there's about 300 people coming so far, but it's at the Limes Room at the Town Hall, so it can accommodate a few hundred more. So do come along. There's some really interesting startups there. I'm not going to tell you any more at the moment, but I know all of them, and some of them are more technology oriented, some of them are more food oriented. It's a really interesting group. And you can all read, so I won't go into the rest of it. And this is going on at the moment. Applications extended, are they? 12th of May, okay. Now he come up. He was eager, wasn't he? Now.
Yeah, I'll pick my way.
So can we, Steve?
1, 2, check. 2.
Go for
All
it.
right, cool.
Don't wander too far off. The camera cuts off about there, so step this way. That's it.
Okay, cool. So hi, I'm Stephen. I work for Catalyst. I run our GIS team, and I was told that I had only 2 minutes, so I'm going to try really hard to stick to that anyway because I'm a considerate person. So, about GIS Core and the pitch. So spatial data is about places and points and areas and connecting that up with good old tabular data. And if you're going to do that in a serious way, then you would be using a GIS, which is Geospatial Information System for people who have always wondered. And so you've got your spatial data and you've got a bunch of it and you want to make maps and you want to share them. And by the way, we don't think about this very much, but probably most of us hold data sets that have location information. It's actually really quite unusual to find one that doesn't. And maybe you want to mash your data up with data from other sources, or you want to explore it, or you want to share it with other people to use and to mash up and explore. I'm guessing that people here are mostly actually builders and consumers of systems that other people are ultimately the end users of. So here's the angle for you. You need a spatial data platform to build on, but running a full GIS yourself is painful and they're typically expensive, especially around licenses for end users. So what we have done is build a spatial database and metadata catalog and a map server and all the other good stuff that is fully platform as a service. And we monitor it and we manage it and we upgrade it and we support it, and you just pay for the usage, not for the users. So there's no licensing fee, it's fully open source, it's already in production, and we keep working on it so it's going to get better, and you can talk to us. Or to me. I'm right here all evening. Thanks.
Done. Well done. Thank you. And he stuck to time. We like that. Thank you, Stephen. Who's up now? Where's Josh? I've lost him. There he is. Josh, you're all mic'd up. So I get to do the intro badly. Stay over there. Josh Brody is a technical team leader of lateral security. I'll skip over some of the words. What just happened? It went dark. Lateral services include penetration testing, source code review, risk assessment, and a bunch of other stuff. Josh manages the Christchurch team of security professionals and has been working in audit and testing roles for 9 years. Welcome, Josh. I know what to do.
Do I? Do I know what to do?
I don't know. We'll find out.
We'll figure it out. All right, I'm Josh Brody, as Neil said. I'm going to give you a comprehensive understanding of information security in the next 15 minutes. All right, so buckle in. I'm not going to be able to do that, so I'm going to have to prioritize the time I have, the resources I have, figure out what's best for this audience, and go with that. And that's the point of this is going to be, that's the same thing you need to do when you're managing your information security program. No matter how big your organization is, there are just some controls that are more worthwhile to invest time and money in than others. So this is going to be the best bang for buck, the critical controls you can put in place to defend your organization. So I'm Josh Brody. I'm a manager of hackers at Lateral Security effectively, and what our organization does is we come in, we help people develop a security program for their organization, we help them identify what risks they're facing, and then pick controls that are going to be best equipped to defend them, and then we let the hackers at them and we figure out whether those controls are working. So when I tell people that I am a hacker, they imagine something like this. They imagine this Hollywood hacker that popular culture kind of conjures up for you, this kind of incredible adversary who is a mastermind with everything cyber. They can grab wires and take control of any computer device nearby. There's this impression that information security is this esoteric subject and this kind of unobtainable, unassailable position where, no matter what you put in place, these hacker wizards out there, they've got something that's going to trip you up, and it might not even be worth throwing anything at it. That couldn't really be anything further from the truth. In reality, cybercrime is boring. There definitely are incredible, well-resourced attackers out there, but most of the things that you're dealing with day to day as a business in New Zealand are going to be relatively mundane things. And even if you're dealing with advanced attackers, this kind of basic information security hygiene stuff it's still the stuff that's going to trip them up and going to defend your organization. So rather than being Mr. Robot, day to day I wind up being a lot more like a dentist. So I'll sit down with an organization and I'll say, all right, so are you keeping on top of patching? And they'll say, oh, well, we really try, but it's it is hard to do, and we've got limited time and money, and we do the best we can. And we'll say, well, great. And are you patching critical vulnerabilities within about 48 hours? And they'll go, it's kind of that sense at the dentist, like, am I going to be shamed or are they here to help? Like, I do my best. And we'll go, great. And multi-factor authentication, have you got it turned on all of your external-facing systems, or even just the critical ones, your webmail and your VPN and your cloud management platforms? And they go, well, that one's a bit harder to get over the line with the users. We're not doing so hot on that. And we go, well, great. We'll take a look at what you've got. We'll figure out what needs tidying up, and we'll develop a plan to fix things going forward. So when we have these conversations, which controls are the ones that we pick out with our years of experience of breaking into systems as the ones that really mess us up if we're trying to attack a system? The first one is definitely patching, which I mentioned in the introduction. Essentially, I'm not going to use this limited time to dive into a detailed idea of how to develop a patch management program for your organization. All of the controls that I'm talking about tonight are well exhaustively explored by cert.gov.nz, which is our government cybersecurity arm. They've got detailed guides on how to implement these, how to determine how you need to develop your program, and so on and so on. But I'm just going to try and summarize these in a bit more of a practical way, because there's a sense that everybody knows, if they're managing systems, that keeping on top of security updates is abstractly important. It's a good idea. But figuring out what that actually means when you've got an attacker coming after you is a bit less clear. So I'm going to talk about, for patching and probably for some other examples, a particular vulnerability, which is CVE 2018-13379, if anybody's taking notes. And if you look that one up, you'll find out that that is a path traversal vulnerability in Fortinet's SSL VPN. So if you get a login interface for a VPN, which over the COVID times, everybody has probably had to use at some point, a lot of people rolled these out over this time, which you will find could have led into some of these issues. This is an issue where instead of going to the VPN login page, in which you provide a username and password and get access, there was a vulnerability where an attacker could go to a different URL on that same site, and instead of giving a username and password, they are provided with usernames and passwords for the users who have logged in recently. Reasonably impactful, because a VPN then typically will get you onto that person's internal network or wherever they've decided that VPN terminates. So this is a vulnerability which absolutely very difficult to find this vulnerability, and very difficult as the security researcher who discovered it. It takes a lot of know-how to figure out how to do this. But when you're defending your environment, you're not defending yourself against this elite hacker who can whistle codes down the phone line and deploy missiles. You're defending yourself against the random idiots on the internet who read a blog post that said, if you go to this URL, you get the username and password. And so it's kind of the ease of exploitation is the thing that makes patching systems so much more important, is figuring out that who you're defending yourself against is just anybody who can go to a URL in a lot of cases. So in this case, that vulnerability was identified in 2019. In late 2020, CERT noted that there was a massive uptick in exploitation of this vulnerability, which, because people were not able to keep on top of patching this, was very successful. And if you go away after this presentation and find that you essentially weren't patched on this vulnerability late 2020, this is a case where you need to presume that that system is compromised. Unless you have another control in place, because given those credentials, defending in depth, if an organization has got multi-factor authentication in place, it's not impossible for the attacker to get further. But in this case, where you've got a reasonably low-skill adversary targeting a system that they don't know a lot about, they're just following a recipe book about how to hack the system, they get to an interface that says, all right, provide your multi-factor code, and they go, oh, too hard, next company, and they move on. Multi-factor authentication, another case I would say, dive into CERT's deep dive recommendation on how to implement this. There are a variety of different forms of it with benefits and disadvantages. But even if you find that for your users, a full rollout of multi-factor authentication across everything is going to be difficult, similar to patching, similar to any security control, it's recommended that you do a bit of a risk assessment. You look through what systems do we have, how important are they to us, what data are we keeping on them, and you figure out, all right, these are the really important systems. We'll start there. We'll get some easy wins on things that only a handful of people are using that are very important, and go from there. And similarly, I won't speak too much to password managers, but CertNZ and Lateral would recommend that wherever possible, your organization make sure that you are providing password managers to your users. They are just that much more effective. If your users are not sharing credentials between things they create at work and things they create in their personal life, you're much better defended. We get a lot of organizations who will call us and they've had an incident that they need us to dig into. And quite frequently, it's a case where the password that user was using for an external system is in a password dump on the internet. And so it's not a good, difficult thing for an attacker to dive into. The third thing I will dive into quickly is maintaining and testing backups. Organizations are generally pretty good at having a backup of some description, but the thing that is worth pointing out is that when we dive into security incidents, I'm not going to point to anyone who was entertained by the idea of backups when I say organizations are normally pretty on top of that. If you don't have any backups in place, Similarly, do an assessment of what data your business could absolutely not live without, and make sure that you've got 2 copies of it, 2 additional copies of it, one offline, one that is not able to be targeted by an attacker who hits your organization. But the key thing that I want to point out is those backups need to be tested, or they're not really worth that much to you, because there are a number of instances where we find an organization has been compromised, they've been hit by ransomware, that SSL vulnerability could have been used to then drop ransomware onto that network. And then that organization who has got, thinks they have backups in place, go and look at them and they're corrupted, or they haven't been working, or the key data didn't wind up in there. And so you need to be regularly pulling out at least one file, and you need to be making sure that you periodically restore everything from the backup and make sure that it's working. I'm going to quickly run through, how much time do I have left? I was going to start a timer, and then I didn't. It's fine. And then I'm going to quickly run through a bunch of the other important controls. Those top 3 are the ones that are really key. If you take away nothing else, go and make sure that you feel like you're on top of those. Look at the CERT implementation guidelines and get a sense for what you need to do there. But 70% of the security incidents that were reported to CERT-NZ in Q4 2020 related to phishing and credential harvesting. So organizations need to make sure that they're relatively on top of that. Quite often, people focus on controls that are targeted towards phishing, things like doing a phishing simulation, which tells your organization whether you can be phished or not, which I can tell you for free, you probably can. We just need to ramp up how alarmist the phishing email that we send is. So presuming that you're going to be phished or that you're going to receive a malicious email, it's straight back to that maintaining and testing backups. Take for granted that somebody in your organization will run ransomware at some point, and make sure that that is not the end of your business for the next week. Make sure that you're able to quickly recover from that. Do a bit of digging into the principle of least privilege. This is a situation where you make sure that if an attacker gets access to one of your user's credentials, that user can only do their job. The only thing that user has the permission to do on the network is their job. And hopefully doing that user's job isn't useful to an attacker, or they can just keep doing that user's job, I suppose, in which case you're fine. But make sure that user can't, dump sensitive information from other systems. They can't get onto file shares that they don't actually need to perform their job. Also, the more advanced version of this is making sure that users change what role they have as they move between different tasks, or if they're an administrative user, they only use the administrative user to perform administrative actions, and otherwise they drop back to their standard user. Secure defaults for macros, make sure that that's turned on. That's not one that I need to dig into in much detail. If you have macros that you absolutely need for business functionality, you can look into how you can sign those macros so that your environment knows this is a good macro and all the other macros are trying to attack us. That's the safest state to be in. Reducing and hardening attack surface. This is taking a look at what stuff you have facing the internet and applying all those other controls to it, making sure you've got multi-factor turned on, making sure it's patched. If you're exposing a service or a website to the internet and you don't actually need it to be on the internet, don't put it on the internet. If you've got 3 stakeholders out in the world who are using the system, see if you can lock it down so that only their IP addresses can attack it, or only their computers can not attack it. You want them to be using it. Make sure that only they can use it. Make sure that only their machine can communicate with it with certificates. Logging and alerting. This is a difficult one in terms of time and if we're prioritizing best bang for buck. The alerting side of things, a lot of organizations just don't have the manpower to say, we've got people who can respond to alerts in a timely manner. But at a minimum, make sure that you're taking logs off the systems that are generating them, events related to authentication, events related to failed multi-factor challenges, and you're storing those on a different system so that if you need to get someone like us or like your internal team to come in and investigate an incident, they're not just looking at the logs on the device that the attacker has been mucking around on, because then they open up the logs and they say, everything's fine, lol. All right, the attacker's been here. So you want to make sure that those logs are on a separate device that you can then go to in the event of an incident, and configure some minimal alerting so that someone gets a notification if something really weird happens. And then further hardening around network segmentation. Ideally, any computer device that you have should be isolated in a zone based on what its responsibilities are, based on what its sensitivity is. This barely makes it into a best bang for buck slide. It's a very effective control, but if you already have a network, it's also very difficult to figure out exactly how you're going to divvy it up and segment it after the fact. So even thinking about going forward, when you build new systems, how important is the system? Does it belong in just the bucket of every computer we have? Or do we start creating new buckets where we put these systems? So briefly, the controls to focus on: reducing the likelihood of a security incident, patching systems, making sure that there's multi-factor authentication, making sure that users are encouraged to use the system in a way that they're not going to reuse credentials, which means giving them a password manager and some education on that, securing macros and then hardening that attack surface. That makes you less likely to have a security incident, but you're still going to have one. So then make sure that the impact of that is reduced by making sure you can recover quickly from it, making sure that the extent of the damage is reduced because any given user that someone lands on can't do too much to your environment, making sure you find out about it as quickly as possible and you can find out what happened after the fact, and making sure that if the attacker lands on one of your workstations or servers, they can't bounce around your entire network with free reign. For further information, check out cert.gov.nz, the OWASP project, and the CIS controls. Otherwise, I presume I'm out of time and I won't go to any of my bonus slides that I optimistically threw in there. Otherwise, opening the floor to questions, and happy to, if anyone has more sensitive questions given the subject matter, happy to. Do I have time for questions?
You do.
Otherwise, I can have a chat afterwards.
I have no idea what you were just talking about there. When I was a developer, we didn't have to worry about all that. Actually, it was in the early 90s, so what can I say? And it was also in military systems, so I had people with guns to look after stuff like that. But questions for Josh?
So do organisations normally engage you when they've had an incident, or do you get people doing it proactively?
We generally get people doing it proactively, but we also get people doing it once they've had an incident. Most of the work we do is proactive in that we're testing systems, and more proactive in that even before someone has an idea for a system they want to build, and they'll call us up and say, look, we're going to build a file server, or we're going to build a web interface that accepts XML, and we say, we've seen so many of those, we know every mistake you could possibly make. Here's a list of things not to do in advance, and then they can go away, and we don't have to, once it's built, say, great, here are all the things we would have told you could have happened, go back to the drawing board, build it again, the investment you've put into that has been wasted. So as early as possible, we get people to talk to us. We definitely get people who call us and say, look, we've been compromised and we need to get things stood back up. That's less of what our focus is, but that is something that we can help out with as well.
Any others? Wandering Mike? Graham?
Thanks, Neil. So there's been a few papers over the recent years about perhaps the demise of the need of passwords, that other forms of security, particularly MFA, might replace the need for passwords and deal to that problem of people reusing passwords. Do you have views on that?
I think optimistically, everybody in security wants to get rid of passwords. Big players like the Googles of the world are starting to get up to a place where they can credibly build a system that doesn't need passwords. For anyone who is not at that kind of, anyone who is not at the bleeding edge of replacing passwords should probably still be using passwords in combination with another factor, unless you've done a robust risk assessment on why you don't need them. But I think optimistically, we all want to get rid of passwords. They're terrible, but they're also the best thing we have in terms of locking down our accounts at the moment. Looking forward to seeing in practice how battle-hardened the new proposals, the new kind of passwordless proposals are. I think it takes a bit of a longer, we need a longer period of time of those big players who can weather those storms, testing out a passwordless world, before the rest of us go, all right, well, they did it and it didn't mess them up too much. We can start to move on to that.
One more. You again.
I can ask another one.
Big voice.
Should I use my browser to remember passwords?
Ideally, no, but if you're tossing up between using your browser to remember passwords and using one password for everything, then use your browser. Similarly, if you've got people in your life who are tossing up between writing all their passwords down in a book and using the same password on everything, put it in a book. There's kind of tiers of, ideally, everyone's using a password manager, generating 60 character passwords in the password manual, or whatever the max the site allows, and checking those in there. And then as you scale down towards anything is better than just using a few passwords for everything.
Okay, maybe one more. Well, we'll need a mic.
You just throw it.
Thanks. What's your password policy?
Our password policy. I will defer that to our, we follow, I've got my director here, I was going to throw into it. We defer to NZISM for our password policies effectively, which is maximum of anything higher than 16 characters. You don't need to worry about complexity of anything that long. And then if you can't manage a 16-character password because a system you're using doesn't support it, then you go back to those password complexity rules and you change it frequently. And use a password manager. Yeah, I think given that for our organization, the bulk of the organization is more paranoid than anyone has justification to be, the rule we put in place is like actually limiting it's like don't go too ridiculous with the password to the point that you can't get into systems.
Do you ever try and hack yourself?
All the time. Yep.
That's a good short answer and a good point to finish on. Sorry.
Do you recommend a particular password manager?
No.
So, Josh. Thank you, Josh. Big hand for Josh. And if you could... Can you hand over your mic to whichever of these two is first? Oh, there was more. Bonus. There's a bonus slide, Josh.
There was a bonus slide.
Oh, okay, bonus slide, everybody. And thank you. And we done... Oh, whew. Okay. We just need to mess around and hand over mics and so on. And whilst we do so, I have my script, which I've put a pen through some bits. Bruce Melrose, Portfolio Manager, Business Analyst, and Shane Cossar, Portfolio Test Manager at Qual IT. Shane has an extensive career in software testing, and at Qual IT in Christchurch was responsible for providing enterprise-level test management and test consultancy. I'll skip the last bit if you don't mind. In contrast, Bruce, based in Wellington, has spent most of his career working in business analysis as well as consulting. Over the last 5 years, he's moved into leadership and capability management roles. Together, their combined insight will facilitate a discussion on data protection assurance from two angles, both the roles and approach to data security, then practical considerations within your test environments. So who is up first, whilst I get a mic to the second?
That'll be me. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Oh, good. We thought we'd do something a little bit different this evening, insofar as we're going to tag team this. I've got about 10 minutes. Shane's going to take over from me. As it was just said, I run BA teams, so I'm going to probably have a little bit of a different level of discussion with you guys, a little bit to what we call a higher level, and then a little bit to the left. And we're just going to work through a little bit of how we frame up solutions to ensure that data protection and security is embedded in those solutions. So, we'll kick off. I thought I'd show you this slide. You're not intended to remember the slide necessarily, other than to perhaps have a reaction to it. Breaks all the good rules of slide presentation, as you'll see, but what it is, it's the data and artificial intelligence landscape for 2019. And the reason why I wanted to show it to you is because there's a lot happening in there. So what could possibly go wrong? If you're working for a big company, if you're working for a small company, chances are you're dealing with some of these people. And so I think that there is something to be said for that. As a business analyst, what I would probably say to my team, and in fact we do say this sort of thing, is what and how do we make sense of all of that? Typically, when we're working with people, we're looking for a data strategy. Data strategy, of course, is something which hopefully will align with the business strategy, setting out the roadmap and the priorities for what you want to do in terms of where you're going now to where you're going in the future. But a good part of a data strategy is a thing called the data governance. And why that's important is because that's got 4 pillars, essentially, within it. And one of them is about how you're going to manage your data. What are the processes that you need in order to be able to manage and use your data? What policies around data do you need to consider? And probably one of the most important ones is how does that all get embedded in the roles that you do? And when they are embedded into the roles that you do, you're starting to create a culture, and that's something that's really important. When you've got those sorts of things in play, and they come in quite often, we're in a position to perhaps start looking around at how we can make sense of some things with consistency. And one of the tools that we've started to use is a thing called a data protection assessment. So I'll just talk a little bit about what that looks like. As I say, if you're working, it doesn't matter whether it's a big thing or a small thing, you need to understand from a business analysis perspective, what are we dealing with? And should we even consider data protection? If it's a large or a complex piece of work, it's spanning borders, I'd argue that the risk profile for that would indicate that you need to start to have a little bit of a think about what data protection and security looks like. If you're looking at something which is new and innovative, you probably are okay if you remember back a couple of slides there. You're probably okay if you're dealing with Apple, I might argue. Some of you might not, but I'm okay with Apple. I've got a level of trust with those guys, rather than Joe Harvey, who works out of Van Nuys, out of his garage in California. I don't know about him, so I need to probably have a little bit of a think about how he looks after the data that we potentially might share together. So the risk profile for something new, something innovative, is a little bit higher and needs consideration around that. And probably the one that is pretty obvious is that if we're dealing with personal data, especially when it comes to do with children or vulnerable people, we certainly want to have a look at how we're treating that sort of data. We need to ask some questions about what happens to it if it falls into the wrong hands. So we can assess those things and come up with a profile as to how we want to look at data protection and the solutions that we're building. In terms of actually embedding it into those solutions, things that we start to look at are around the data and the source systems and where the vulnerabilities of those lie. These can be quite variable, and people ask me, what does a business analyst do? Well, it's a very hard one to answer because it will depend on how big or small the footprint of what it is that you're doing. One of the things that we would be doing, those would be working with the likes of Josh over there in terms of trying to figure out where those vulnerabilities might lie and how we might bake those in. We'd certainly look at the processing that needs to support the handling of data, and particularly around the access and privacy. We seem to run up with a lot of problems around this one. It's not enough to say that we've just got our data within a system. We actually do run into situations where we have data which might be well protected within a system, but then is made freely available to be printed out and taken out of a secure location, out of a building, and left on a bus for someone to pick up and read. So we need to start to understand a lot more around who should be able to access data and what are the consequences of what happens if that data falls into the wrong hands. And in terms of what the business analyst then does, is that they will then look at building any of those recommendations that they have assessed and looked at into the features and into the product that is being built, so that they can be prioritised and that they can be put into the overall solution in a way that sort of makes sense. And then they start to get tested and looked at. And so I think that's where Shane and his team come into it. So I'm going to pass over to Shane to continue the story.
Thank you, Bruce. Hello. So I'm at the other end of the spectrum, primarily in the testing space, and I'm going to talk about three real concepts here. One is that for a lot of organisations, there's still a lot of use of production data in test environments, and that's the reality. And the other is that you need to put controls around some of that, so you need to think of the ownership, and that's a very difficult set of questions for most organisations. And the third one is that once that production data is in your test environment, it needs to be managed from a setup perspective and also a closeout teardown perspective. So we'll start with really the premise that privacy still applies to the use of production data in test environments. In New Zealand, we've got the recent introduction of the Privacy Act, but in the EU, there's General Data Protection Regulation, and these legislations are primarily there to sort of get businesses to start formalising privacy processes, and they tend to actually put penalties in place for privacy breaches. To be clear here, we're talking about personal information. We're not talking about company information. We're talking about information that's personally identifiable about people. So even though this legislation is quite recent, the problem about privacy goes back decades for breaches out of test systems. The most famous goes back to 1997, which is in the UK. There was a set of printed letters sent out to banks' premium customers starting off, "Dear Rich Bastard," which obviously didn't go down with either the customers or the management of the business. So this is a thing that still happens today. The problem is today, with email and other electronic forms such as texting, things happen a lot faster. So if there's one simple rule, and if it's the only thing you do, this rule is that your test environments need to be closed down. So no external emails, texts, a print bureau if you use big print jobs, and so you should be whitelisting any messaging coming out of your test systems. So, very simple measure, but there are still companies that don't do that. The second one is actually starting to get into the complexity. So with this new legislation, there's new roles around, say, a privacy officer. They tend to focus on production. But because you're using production data in your test systems, and sort of carry on that assumption for a wee while, really got three aspects of ownership. One is business involvement to actually identify the risks. So I'm currently testing Holidays Act remediation. Most people recognise that salary information is very sensitive, but there's new changes for domestic violence leave. It's even more sensitive. So where are the risks around what data you're processing, who's allowed to actually see some of that, and who can actually process it? So there's a number of considerations. First of all is the context. Just who needs to see what, and do you need that data at all? I mentioned sort of there under the understanding aspect, the concept of logs and notification. Because you need a controlled environment, you do need to keep track of who uses the data, who's accessing the system. Some systems you might be using an actual person and changing their privileges for access. Other systems you might be having generic logins. So who's actually using that login today, tomorrow, the other day? You also have the concept of stewardship. Typically this will be your test manager or a test practice manager. So someone who actually looks at the overall picture and says, yeah, that's how we're going to do this. At the lower level, you've got the custodian, maybe a DBA, someone who actually does the copying and the refresh and the tear down if necessary. Measure number 2 is really looking at from the ownership aspect and defining and publishing who's allowed to do what. What are the expectations around using this data? Some of it might sound very obvious in terms of, say, salary information, but test policy, and I'm not talking about the sort of policies you find in health that are sort of phone book size. I'm talking about sort of a one-page poster type policy that you stick by the photocopier so that the various people who come in and out of your testing group can see that, okay, if you want to look at this information, that's the person you go to arrange your privileges, and in terms of any other externals access, who's allowed to actually see some of this? If you're government, for example, you're not permitted to have some of this data going offshore. So if you're putting information in bug tickets, you've got to be quite clear about what information is in that. The same as using collaboration tools such as Teams. What are the rules for actually putting files up into Teams where people outside of your project might have access to that? So the second rule, quite simple, establish a test policy. But it does require a lot of thought and a lot of discussion. The third piece is really the hard piece, and this applies to whether you use production data or any other sort of data in a test environment, but there's a definite perspective with production data. First of all, most people sort of are starting to hear that data masking is an option. And it is, but it's not a total solution. There's some things that you can actually deduce from test data. You don't necessarily need to know someone's name, for example, to find out what their salary is. You might want to search on their role, and you'll find out the same sort of information. In terms of content, does everything in that database actually need to be there? Some systems are very sensitive, might have VIP flags, might have other sensitive files, might have scanned files, doctor's notes, for example. So what do you need to bring in when you actually build a test environment, when you refresh it, and how does that apply to actually what you're testing? A lot of test environments don't manage a full-size copy out of production. So how do you determine your slice of life, and how do you determine any outliers that you want to bring in? Synthetic data is an option, but usually for things such as performance testing. If you're testing any legacy systems, you really do want to have some problem data in there. So having nice content, yeah, it might work really well, but it's not necessarily going to uncover some of those edge cases that people look for. And as part of the actual build process, how are you going to store this? Putting it in the cloud may or may not be a solution. As I say, if you're government, there's only certain places that you can actually store that. And of course, you've got virtualization. So the third measure is establish a repeatable and, most importantly, secure setup and teardown process around the use of that production data. So I'm going to come back to the dear rich bastards. The current legislation has very much a focus on penalties, financial input. But from a organisation reputation and pure embarrassment factor and competence sort of people who might be involved in any of these breaches, there are consequences. So you do need to think of that higher risk. Just if you do breach out of your test environment, and it still happens quite regularly, what are the consequences going to be? Because it's really quite identifiable as to who's done something, or sometimes not done something, such as turn off a batch job that runs overnight. So those three things: lock down your environment, establish your ownership, and build your setup and teardown process are sort of the keys to controlling that use of production data. Because after all, sort of this legislation is really setting in place expectations around what we're doing to protect the customers, the patients, the staff, the students, whoever's actually involved with the data. And it's highlighting that this is important and the government sort of wants it addressed. So thank you. Any questions for Bruce or myself?
Just stand over here on camera. You don't have to hug him, but... So any questions for these two? There's one over here because he's easy to reach. There he is.
Okay, so I was interested in how you balance the sort of needs for testing that the system does what it's supposed to do in the real world versus making sure that it can't do stuff in the real world that is going to impact privacy. So it's kind of like, there's a really nasty tension and it's very hard to... Have you got any tips around how you balance those needs?
Yep, so the first part is that analysis, the risk analysis in particular, just what are your potential problems and how might they arise. And the other is addressing, as part of, say, your regular environment builds, identifying if you're doing, say, a BAU upgrade and it's a fairly standard regression test, that you have a build that takes this data. But if you're doing something else that requires, say, the VIP information or some other sensitive sort of information to be brought across, that you have a version 2 of that build that brings across the different data. But that's where the distinction between the owner, the custodian and the steward come in. They all have a place. You know, so one person brings across the right data, but it's the owner, and that really needs to be a business involvement, not just IT, to identify what are the risks.
That's why that cultural aspect's so important. You actually build that into, roles, not people, roles that are more enduring.
Anybody else? I've got to do a big walk now.
Hi there. I was wondering, have you come across any situations where you have had to look at things to do with digital sovereignty, to do with Indigenous groups or people? And are there any particular considerations around that?
I haven't for Indigenous. I've worked in law enforcement, health, education, some other government departments where sort of confidential information, but not Indigenous. The same principles apply. Just what is the risk? So, for example, the concept of personally identifiable information has its own discussion. Just what is that? It might be someone's name, but it's usually association with other confidential information. I used the salary and example before, but it depends on the context. What is associated with, say, those Indigenous peoples? Is it an address? I did some work for a client a couple of years ago where the deduction aspect, they had some special rules built in so that when clients or customers use their own queries, that if they tried to delve down, that if they did a query for that piece of data, trying to find that piece, that they sort of knew that if you were doing another query, that you're trying to find out what the gap was. So it can get very sophisticated in terms of what some of these rules might be, but it's all about context.
One more. Do I see a hand? Any hands? No hands? No hands. All done. Everybody wants to go home for dinner, I'm guessing. In that case, thank you so much, Bruce and Shane. Thanks for IT. And that, as they say, is a wrap. We don't have an event in June. Next one, I think, is July the 6th. What am I supposed to do? Oh, I'm supposed to click through. Thank you for the prompt. There you go. So the Tech Week event, and then 6th of July at ARA. Then there's an event in August, don't know the date. And then, did I say Tech Summit? 2nd of September? I did, didn't I? You see what I did there? Anyway, life was much simpler, I feel, when I was testing software in the early 90s. We used to just use Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and stuff like that. But anyway, thanks so much to our speakers this evening from Qual IT and Lateral. Much appreciated. Thanks to you all for coming. These events mean nothing unless people show up. I usually encourage people to go and do more networking and drink the rest of the beer, but Devi tells me off when I do that because that costs us money. It's on sale at return. So beer is bad for you. Don't drink any more beer, but go and do some more networking and then go home, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for coming.